The Braves moved from Boston to Milwaukee, but there were several others. In fact, between 1953 and 1972, 10 teams moved. And 2 more were added on later on. I don't mean to rub salt in Phillips' issues here, his travel and now losing his franchise, but here we are. So this is a list of the teams that have moved since 1953, and again, like Jeff said, not dealing with anything before that because even it's a kind of a gray area with the Yankees as to whether they actually moved or were given back to the American League. So better not to open that can of worms. Starting with the Braves, like I said, Jeff touched on a lot of this, so I won't spend too much time on them. But it was very sudden. About a month before the season began was the announcement that they said they were leaving, and people were kind of dumbfounded by this. The fans did not expect it. They saw the low attendance, but they didn't expect it that it would come this soon. And the media also was a bit flabbergasted, although they did print a picture from the May 14th, 1952 game with a paid crowd of 825 people. That's just a little bit less than we have here today. Lou Brady did commit to 2 more seasons in Boston after the 1952 season, but apparently he was lying. So they moved, and again, like Jeff had mentioned, they had offers from San Francisco. LA was also discussed as a possibility, but Milwaukee was where it was focused because of the fact that other people had eyes on the territory, and the Braves owned it, and they didn't want anybody taking that potential major league city from them, and they ended up moving. The Browns were the ones who were looking at it most heavily and were rejected, like Jeff had alluded to, but the Cardinals also had looked into moving to Milwaukee until they were bought by the Anheuser-Busch company, and they ended up staying in St. Louis. Speaking of, we have the fan reaction for the Braves first. People were not happy, but they understood it. My favorite quote is the third one there, I believe. The one that says "phooey," either way. That's my favorite quote, just because it's a very 1950s word. But you can see some of the reaction there from some of the fans. Basically, the range of reactions was anger, disappointment, but sort of understanding it, even though they didn't quite understand the quick timing of it. And this one was a very well thought out, and this guy went to a lot of trouble writing this letter to the editor, is what he did. It is a very profound quote. Now we have the Browns from St. Louis to Baltimore for the 1954 season. They tried to move for the 1953 season, but they were told it is too close to the start of the season. You can't do it, despite the fact that the Braves were told, yeah, sure, you can move to Milwaukee, even though it's about the same time frame. And they had issues as well. They were losing money. They didn't know if St. Louis could support 2 teams. That was the big issue with that. Bill Beck, he was the principal owner at the time, and he cited significant losses. He also didn't make any friends on the owner's side of things because of the fact that he was hesitant to add TV, and he also did not want to cut them in on it. He wanted to share it himself because they were losing money at the gate, so he wanted to make that up from the other team's TV money. And they basically told him, no, you can't do that. And we're not putting you on TV at night because, well, that's going to make you lose even more money. Baltimore really wanted the Browns and threatened legal action if it didn't happen. And as you'll see from time and again, they threatened to bring in Congress and to break the antitrust exemption. That's a threat that a lot of cities use. It happened quite a bit. And because they had to play a lame duck season in St. Louis, the attendance was terrible. Nobody went. And the play on the field was just as bad because they're the Browns, and that's what they did. And the fans also, they realized that the attendance was just terrible. This is the actual move when they were allowed to move from St. Louis to Baltimore. And basically, they, like Jeff alluded to, they wanted to drive Beck away from the game. They only approved the move from St. Louis to Baltimore after he sold the team. Once he sold the team, sure, you can move, it's fine, no other issues. But until he got out, they refused to allow him to move. The fans, they didn't like Bill. They hung him in effigy, and this is one of the first times we will see somebody hung in effigy. It comes up again. They didn't like him. They blamed him entirely. The media, though, was a little bit more on his side and could see the greed, as they called it, of the other owners. But the fans definitely did not care for Bill Beck and his shenanigans. Not as hated as Charlie Finley, but it's close. And then you can see some more of these. My favorite one of these is when somebody called him a stuffed sports shirt. That was his nickname. He was the sports shirt which is a polo shirt for anybody who doesn't speak 1950s. And the fans really let him have it. They hung him in effigy. I was trying to remember the date of the game. It was in September of 1953. They hung that in effigy at the game. Then we have the A's moving from Philadelphia to Kansas City for the start of the 1955 season. So we have 3 in a row, right off the bat. Connie Mack was getting old. That was kind of the main problem here with the A's. He had owned them for quite some time, and he had been going on years, and in fact was probably not even running the team on a day-to-day operation at this point in time. He was a bit enfeebled. His family had taken over, Roy and Earl. They were his stepsons. One was his son, one was his stepson, and they were running it. They had some issues. There was a family feud, and that really caused this process to be a bit messier than they would have liked it to be. The media did try to intervene, and so did City Hall. They actually created a Save the A's campaign where they tried to raise money to keep the A's in Philadelphia. The thermometer that the Philadelphia Inquirer would put in the paper on a daily basis, it disappeared after a while, and that was because it wasn't working. So they just stopped backing the effort entirely. There were fans who were willing to contribute money to it. The first gentleman there, he was one of the leaders of this campaign to keep the A's in Philadelphia, and he was willing to contribute money and have sort of a season pass type of thing. But for the most part, it didn't work. And one gentleman followed the A's. He had been to every opening day of the franchise since 1903, and then he went to the first game in Kansas City the following year, traveled from Philadelphia. So they made a news story about him. He was a fairly interesting guy, and then he decided he would stick around for the next day because they won. And then the last quote there is one that I really like. It's an unnamed person, which is unfortunate, but the Phillies were having a welcome home gathering in a parade before the start of the 55 season, and Philadelphia Inquirer referred to one lone fan who at the end of the parade, when everything was breaking up, just shouted, "Save the A's." He might have been the only one who was trying to save the A's, but he was still there. So now we have the Giants, moving from New York to San Francisco. The Giants are an interesting case because the fans didn't really give up on the team. They stuck with them. I'll show you more about that in a moment, but they were losing money, and it was pretty evident that they were the third wheel in New York behind the Yankees, who were winning consistently, the Dodgers, who were in the World Series every year and also drew well. The Giants at the Polo Grounds, not quite the case. There was a lot of issues there. Plus, they lost revenue when the football Giants, moved from the Polo Grounds across the river to Yankee Stadium for the 1956 season. And they were also losing money because just the attendance left. Nobody knows really where all their fans went. Some media people speculated that they became Yankee fans, other people that they moved to the suburbs. The neighborhood also changed. There was a lot of factors there as to why the Giants just couldn't make money. In fact, I interviewed Horace Stone's granddaughter, and she said they've been losing money since 1947, and were kind of considering a move to Minneapolis, even as far back as 1947. She's the only source on that. I haven't seen it documented anywhere else, but I'll trust the granddaughter of the guy who owned the team. She probably had a little bit of insight there. The media liked Horace Stone, but they kind of just viewed him as a fan who happened to be in the owner's box. He didn't really have a lot of gravitas behind him. And also, there is the consistent rumors of his drinking. He enjoyed to indulge quite a bit. And that kind of, I guess, endeared him, but also garnered no real sympathy for him from the media. Again, the hanging comes up, but the last game, a lot of the fans called for him to be hung because of the move. But he had a quote, I don't have it here, but he had a quote in the newspapers where it was, the kids are complaining that nobody's coming, that the Giants are moving, but I don't see a lot of the parents out of the games. And he was right. There was also an issue at the Polo Grounds where there was a bullet that was fired from one of the apartments across the street, and somebody was killed. It was an accidental shooting. It was a kid playing with a gun, but he killed somebody at the Polo Grounds, and that's just evidence that the neighborhood was sort of deteriorating at that point in time. The Giants fans, they stuck with the team. There were the recreations on the radio by Les Kiter, which you would hear on 1010 Wins. And Steve Rothschild of the New York Giants Preservation Society mentioned that fact, basically that they didn't lose the team, they still have them. They could hear the recreations. The West Coast games were recreated, they played at 4 o'clock West Coast time. they would recreate them a little later on in New York, and Les Kiter did sound effects, and he just basically read off of a ticker, from my understanding, and just recreated the games as to what happened. So a lot of Giant fans actually stuck with the team. And when I did have the opportunity to interview Willie Mays before his death, he said that a lot of the Giant fans made the trip to Philadelphia. When the Giants took me to play the Phillies, there was a lot of Giants fans there. So it's different than our next entry, the Dodgers. A lot of the Dodger fans, they gave up on baseball until about 1962 when the Mets came back. And a lot of Dodger fans were very, very angry and upset and didn't want anything to do with baseball. And the issues the Dodgers were having was they couldn't get a new stadium. They were playing at Ebbets Field, which was drawing, but it was small, and there was no parking. There even might have been worse than the Giant situation in terms of the parking. Walter O'Malley owned a domed stadium in Brooklyn, near where the Barclays Center currently is. I had been under the misconception that it was the exact area of the Barclays Center, but it is not. It is across the street from the Barclays Center where he wanted. But he ran into opposition from Robert Moses, the noted city planner, for lack of a better title for him. And Robert Moses didn't want to use eminent domain to clear the land to get rid of some of the meat markets that were there to help Walter O'Malley. The reason was he wanted to build an all-purpose stadium in Queens so that the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees could all play in Flushing Meadows, the area that ended up becoming Citi Field. I'm sorry, Shea Stadium, then Citi Field. But the Dodgers wanted to be a part of that because, in O'Malley's words, if the Dodgers aren't in Brooklyn, they're not the Brooklyn Dodgers. So Los Angeles is okay. All right, whatever. Jersey City was also brought into play too, because in 1956 and 57, the Dodgers, in an effort to try to get more of an effort to build a stadium, they played a handful of games at Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City for 2 seasons. There was never really an intention to move to Jersey City, but they used it as a threat, as leverage to try to get Moses to move on the project they wanted in downtown Brooklyn. The media liked O'Malley at first. They called him a dedicated baseball man, but afterward he was presented as greedy and duplicitous. So the media turned on him too, just like the fans did. The fans, though, they did not care for O'Malley one bit. They blamed him more than they did Robert Moses, which is interesting. In the aftermath, in later years, it's now become Moses who's kind of become the villain in this story more so than O'Malley. But O'Malley, at the time, was viewed as basically the devil incarnate. And there's an anecdote: if you had 3 bullets in a gun and you had to kill Hitler, Stalin, or Walter O'Malley, what do? You shoot Walter O'Malley 3 times. That was the Dodger fan perspective about that. When the Senators moved from Washington to Minnesota, this is the first Senators, get to the second one in a second, the Senators were terrible, had always been terrible, except for a brief period where they had winning teams with Walter Johnson. But after that, they were bad. After the end of World War II, really, they were just a terrible franchise. But they still made money. Calvin Griffith was the owner, and at first was presented as a well-meaning but cheap. That is the key issue with him. He was cheap. He was also a bit bumbling in that the media presented that he didn't know what he was doing, he would lose money, and then he would break up the team to try to turn a profit. He also angered the owners because every year at the owners' meeting, basically from 1956 until they moved, he presented the option to move to Minnesota. He really wanted to move to Minnesota. And they kept telling him, you can't do that. We need baseball in Washington because they're going to take away the antitrust exemption if you move the team to Minnesota. The Continental League was a factor, and that was coming. They were going to put teams in markets that were underserved or had lost teams, and that included New York for the loss of the Dodgers and the Giants, also Houston and Denver and Toronto. Eventually all of these cities, except for Buffalo, ended up getting a Major League franchise. But the Continental League was coming, and they wanted to keep it at bay. So they made it basically a compromise where Griffith was allowed to move. And he moved the team to Minnesota, but Washington was given an immediate expansion team. And that didn't sit well with the media or the fans because they basically said, why do we get left with these terrible, terrible players? And that's really, it continued the trend of these Senators just not being good. Which you'll see later on with the second Senators, they weren't any good either. So it really didn't get much better. This is more of a timeline of the events. It was a prolonged process where he just kept asking to move to Minneapolis. and kept getting denied, and they were very annoyed with him. And then eventually he decided that he would stay to get the new federally funded stadium that ended up becoming RFK, but he didn't want to rent it because he owned Griffith Stadium and didn't want to pay rent. It was in a bad location. He just basically, it was clear he didn't want to be in Washington. And Minnesota was where he ended up wanting to be. There's some of the fans, they didn't care for Griffith. They also viewed him as very cheap. Get out Griff, that was my favorite one. That was a sign that was held up during a game. No effigies here, so luckily he avoided that, but they definitely wanted him out of town. They would rather keep the existing team and get rid of him. The Braves moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta in 1966. This was also a bit convoluted. As Jeff mentioned, they were sold to a syndicate that included about 15 people. The head was William Bartholomew, and there were rumors surfacing in 1963 of a move. They wanted to move for the 64 season. There was a handshake agreement in place, but they were not allowed to move because of the fact that I don't think they wanted to give up on the Milwaukee market at that point in time. And eventually they were allowed to move after the completion of Oakland County Stadium. The fans also were, I have to go a little faster, I'm running short on time, so I apologize about that. The fans were not pleased about it. They felt they'd been strung along. The Braves had been very good out of the gate and then fell back toward mediocrity, and the fans felt like they were strung along and they were very angry and they hoped to get a new team shortly. Then there's the Kansas City A's. Oh boy, Charlie Fenwick. He took over the team after the death of Arnold Johnson, who had moved them from Philadelphia. And almost right out of the gate, he angered people in Kansas City because he wanted to do a fireworks night. And the city said no, because it's loud and people are complaining. So right away, he said, we're moving to Dallas. And that was turned down. Rumors popped up again in 62, 63 of Atlanta or Oakland. He wanted to go to Oakland. He was all in on that. He had signed a 7-year lease with the city of Kansas City, with the old city council. They tore it up when the new council came in. And they said, no, the lease expired because he didn't want to renegotiate a new one during the season. He waited until October to start negotiating when his lawyer came back from Europe. And then he decided that they would move out of the stadium and build a temporary stadium in a cow pasture. Yes, that was a real thing that he proposed. It didn't happen. He wanted the same treatment as the Chiefs, basically. And eventually they agreed on a 4-year lease, even though he had agreed to move to Louisville. Before the start of the 1964 season, Major League Baseball told him, no, you got to negotiate with Kansas City. You have to go back. Eventually he was allowed to move to Oakland in 1968. And we'll get back to him. He wants to move again in 1969 after he got to Oakland. So it didn't go well. The fans hated Charlie Finley, which you can see right here. They viewed him basically as a carny, and they wanted him out of town as fast as they could. They were hoping a new team could come and be run less like a sideshow. They did not hang him in effigy, but this one they did. The Seattle Pilots. This was a one-year wonder, 1969 to 1970. They moved in early 1970 to Milwaukee. The Pilots were granted an expansion team with the guarantee of building a domed stadium that eventually became the King Dome, but it wasn't done. And then the city dragged its feet on construction. They dragged their feet on approving the financing for the dome, and the team had to open up the stadium with the construction still ongoing. So they had to basically nail in the sections of bleachers as fans were filing in. The team also had to deal with paint on their uniforms and nails on coming out of the benches because the city did a horrible job with the construction, and they demanded money, back money. The owners, who were the Sorianos, said they were paid up through 1969, said they weren't going to pay any future rent. They went into bankruptcy, were bought out of bankruptcy by the Bud Selig Group, and moved to Milwaukee at the start of the 1970 season. Fans also, they didn't really get a chance to get attached to the Pilots. One fan there said he wishes he could have gone to a game with his dad. And that was pretty much the main sentiment for that. Then the second Senators, and this is where we have a dummy comes into play, not a hanging in effigy dummy, but a dummy nonetheless. The Senators had a lot of ownership groups that went through their 10-year tenure, from Pete Casada all the way to Bob Short. Bob Short was the villain. He was the one who wanted to constantly move the team to Texas. And after he did move the team, they brought out a dummy that basically, they held a sign too that said, where is the sign? Oh, short stakes. That was their slogan for the Senators when that happened. They brought a dummy when the Texas Rangers came back to Baltimore, and they held it up to harass him with the sign, short still stakes. Then you have the Expos. This went on forever. It's everybody. It's the city, it's the government, it's the fans, it's the media. Everybody's to blame for this one. I wish I had more time to go into the details of it, but I have to go through this very quickly. I will end on the Oakland A's, which is great because it segues perfectly into our next speaker. The A's moved to Sacramento. They've tried for 30 years to get a stadium built. After the Raiders moved back from Oakland, they tried for 30 years through various ownership groups, various city councils, nothing done. They tried Fremont, they tried San Jose, they tried Sacramento. There were various threats to move, various proposals in Oakland. None of them went anywhere. And John Fisher, who ended up as the primary owner in 2005, I believe, did not really commit to the roster or to actually funding much of the stadium. So eventually, you can see how long this process went on. Eventually, they did get the go-ahead to move to Las Vegas, but not for 3 years. So they have to play in Sacramento, or West Sacramento, if you will, for the next few years. And then the quote that I got here is when my wife and I were online at the last game in Oakland, and it's the second one there. It's like your grandma has this great meal that she always prepares. One time you know it's going to be the last time you ever have that meal. Sure, you may get the recipe, but it will never be the same. And that quote to me was the perfect summation of how the Oakland A's fans felt about the franchise in relation to the debacle of trying to get a stadium there. Again, I apologize for rushing through the last few minutes, but I want to yield the floor to our next speaker.